Hi, everyone. My name is Ethan, 27 years old. And for most of my life, I thought I understood how my family worked. My dad was a quiet man, the kind who believed that working hard and keeping your head down solved most problems. My mom was his opposite, warm, talkative, and the glue that held everyone together. When she passed away from cancer during my senior year of high school, everything cracked open. My dad didn't handle grief well. Within a year, he remarried a woman named Carol, who had a daughter named Alyssa. And 2 years later, they had a son together, my half-brother Jacob. He's 6 now, bright, talkative, and completely innocent in all the chaos that surrounds the adults in his life. At first, I tried to be understanding. I was 18, about to leave for college, and my dad seemed happy again. Carol acted like the perfect stepmother, always baking cookies, smiling too much, saying things like, "We're a family now." But the second my mom's photos came off the living room wall, I knew something was different. Carol wasn't cruel in a direct way. She was polite to your face, but chipped away at you in small, calculated moves. She'd forget to tell me about family gatherings. She'd make little comments like, "Oh, Ethan, I could never afford a college like yours," while looking at my dad like she was the real victim of my scholarship. Still, I focused on my own life. I went to college on scholarships, worked part-time jobs, and learned how to live independently. I was proud when I bought my own apartment at 24, a small one-bedroom place with a creaky floor and a balcony door that never fully closed. But it was mine, paid for with my own money, no loans from anyone. My dad even helped me move in. Carol pretended to be happy for me, saying, "It's nice to see young people taking responsibility." But after that, she rarely mentioned it, except in ways that made it sound like I'd stolen something from her and Alyssa. Alyssa was 14 when I met her, and even then she had that smug, manipulative streak her mother perfected. When she turned 23, she dropped out of college, got pregnant, and the father disappeared before the baby was born. Carol immediately shifted into victim mode, telling anyone who'd listen how life had been unfair to her daughter. The baby was cute, I'll give her that. But Alyssa acted like motherhood was a social media challenge rather than a responsibility. She had no job, no plan, and no intention of getting either. That's when Carol started changing the tone of every family conversation. Whenever I came by to visit my dad and Jacob, she'd slide in comments like, "You must be so lonely in that apartment all by yourself." Or, "It must be hard maintaining a whole place for just one person." She'd say it with a smile that never reached her eyes. Once, while pouring herself a second glass of wine, she sighed and said, "You know, Ethan, families should help each other. Alyssa and the baby need a stable home. It's not fair that you have extra space while they're struggling." I'd laugh it off and say things like, "Carol, my apartment barely fits me and my couch." But she didn't stop. She started making my apartment sound like a community resource instead of something I'd worked hard to own. My dad mostly stayed silent. He didn't agree with her, but he didn't stop her either. The situation boiled over one Sunday at a family dinner. It was supposed to be a simple meal: lasagna, garlic bread, the usual. My dad, Carol, Alyssa, the baby, and Jacob were all there. I brought a bottle of wine. Everything was normal until Jacob, who was coloring next to me, looked up with his wide 6-year-old eyes and said, "What if you give Mom your apartment? She always complains that you live there." The table went dead silent. I froze mid-bite. Carol's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. My dad looked like he wanted to disappear. Alyssa smirked like she had already won. And that's when it hit me. Carol had been talking about me in front of the kids, framing me as the selfish older brother who refused to help family. She'd probably been telling Jacob that I didn't share, that I was greedy, that I didn't care about them. It wasn't just manipulation anymore. It was a full-blown smear campaign. I looked at Jacob and said with a smile, "That's an interesting idea, buddy. Maybe I should think about it." Carol's eyes widened. For a second, I saw the greed flicker in her expression before she tried to cover it with that same fake sweetness. "Well," she said quickly, It was just something Jacob said. Kids say the funniest things. But I knew better. That dinner told me everything I needed to know. I went home that night and started planning how to draw a line once and for all. Over the next month, I distanced myself. I stopped being their emergency contact for every minor inconvenience. When Carol called and asked if I could co-sign Alyssa's car loan because it's just a Kia, Ethan, and it's for the baby, I told her no. When she asked for a little help with the electricity bill because formula is expensive and Alyssa's job search is taking longer than expected, I said, "Sorry, I'm on a budget too." Every time she hinted that I was heartless, I ignored it. I stopped showing up to every family dinner. When I did visit, I brought small gifts for Jacob and spent most of my time talking to him or my dad. Carol didn't like that. She wanted attention, validation, and preferably my apartment. Then came her birthday. My dad called and said, "Ethan, we're all going to dinner for Carol's birthday. It would mean a lot if you came." I hesitated but agreed. I even brought a gift, an envelope that I knew would get a reaction. We sat at the restaurant, all smiles and forced laughter. Carol kept glancing at me like she expected something grand. When it was time for gifts, I handed her the envelope. She smiled, probably imagining a check or a signed document transferring my apartment to Alyssa. She tore it open, pulled out a photo, and froze. It was a framed picture of my apartment's front door, and underneath, I'd written in bold letters, "Not for sale." The silence that followed was golden. My dad's fork clinked against the plate. Alyssa looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. Carol forced a laugh, but her face was tight. She said, "Oh, Ethan, you always have such a sense of humor." I just smiled and said, "Glad you think so." After that dinner, things went downhill fast. Alyssa started spreading rumors at their church that I refused to help family in need. I got text messages from cousins I hadn't spoken to in years saying things like, "Come on, Ethan, it's just temporary. You can't let a baby be homeless." Carol must have been behind it all, playing the innocent mother whose ungrateful stepson refused to help. That was the moment I decided to finish what I started. I listed my apartment for rent, not to sell it, but to lease it for a year while I took a work opportunity in another city. Within 2 weeks, I found tenants, a quiet middle-aged couple with a cat and steady jobs. I met them, handed over the keys, and signed the lease. When I told my dad about my plans, he looked conflicted. He said quietly, "You're sure about this?" I nodded and told him I needed a change of scenery. He didn't argue. He knew what this was really about, even if he didn't say it. Carol, however, blew up, accusing me of betraying family. 2 months after I moved, I finally started to breathe again. My new city wasn't glamorous, but it was quiet. I had a small rented place near my job, a steady routine, and no passive-aggressive phone calls from Carol about family obligations. It felt good to be out of reach, to live without constantly waiting for the next guilt trip or manipulation. I still called my dad once a week to check in and talk to Jacob, who always asked when I was coming home. Those conversations were the only thing that kept me connected to that house. The rest of them I could live without. Then one Wednesday afternoon, as I was leaving work, I saw my dad's name pop up on my phone. I almost ignored it, assuming it was one of his quick check-ins, but something told me to answer. His voice was strained, the kind of tone people use when they are trying to stay calm but know they're in deep trouble. He said that something had happened at my apartment. My heart sank. For a split second, I thought the tenants might have trashed the place or there had been a break-in. What I didn't expect was what he said next. Apparently, Carol and Alyssa had decided that since I was not using my apartment, it was fair game. They showed up there one morning with boxes, trash bags, and the baby in a stroller. According to my tenants, Carol knocked on the door, and when they opened it, she said, "Hi, we're moving in. This is Ethan's place, right?" As if that somehow explained everything. When the tenants told her they were renting the apartment and had a signed lease, she refused to believe them. She insisted she was family and that it was all a misunderstanding, then tried to push past them to get inside. The tenants, a calm, older couple who clearly had zero patience for nonsense, stood their ground. When Carol wouldn't leave, they called the police. That's when things escalated. Alyssa started crying, saying she had nowhere else to go, and Carol began shouting that it was her stepson's fault for abandoning family. She even tried to guilt-trip the officers, saying that her infant needed shelter and that I'd given them permission to stay there. Of course, she had no proof because I hadn't. The police made it clear that she had no legal right to be there and told her to leave immediately. Carol, in her usual fashion, switched from fake tears to rage in seconds. She accused the tenants of lying, said that I had promised her the apartment, and demanded that they show her the lease. The officers did not entertain her. They escorted her and Alyssa off the property and warned them that if they returned, they'd be charged with trespassing. By the time my dad found out, the story had already started spreading around their neighborhood. Carol tried to save face by telling everyone it was a misunderstanding, that she had just gone to check on the place for me. But it was too late. Word got around that she had been caught trying to move into an occupied apartment, and even some of her friends stopped defending her. Alyssa, of course, played the victim online, posting vague statuses about being betrayed by blood and learning who really cares. My dad was embarrassed. He called to apologize, saying he hadn't known what Carol was planning. I believed him, but I could tell she had roped him into it somehow. He said that Carol had mentioned wanting to look at the place a few times, and he thought she meant just driving by. When she came home angry and ranting about how my tenants were rude, he finally realized what she'd done. I wasn't even angry at first. I was just tired. Tired of the endless drama. Tired of being the villain in Carol's imaginary family feud. Tired of cleaning up the mess she left behind. I told my dad that my tenants had every right to call the police and that I supported their decision completely. He sighed and said that Carol had been crying for hours, claiming I was punishing her and that family doesn't call the cops on family. That was the moment I lost whatever sympathy I had left. Carol had crossed a line, and she knew it. What made it worse was that she didn't even seem ashamed. She was furious that her plan had failed. She didn't care about the embarrassment, the police involvement, or the fact that she had terrified two innocent people. All she cared about was control, about getting what she wanted and spinning the story afterward to make herself the victim. The next week, my tenant sent me photos of the notice the police had left on the door after the incident, an official warning for trespassing. I kept a copy for myself, just in case. They also told me that Carol had driven by the building twice since then, but hadn't tried to enter again. It felt surreal, knowing that the people who were supposed to be my family had turned into strangers, willing to break the law for their own convenience. I called my dad again that weekend. He sounded defeated, older than I'd ever heard him. He admitted that he didn't know how to handle Carol anymore, that every argument turned into her blaming me. He said Jacob had overheard something about me not caring about them, and had been asking why his brother didn't like their mom. That one hit hard. Jacob was innocent, and I didn't want him to grow up believing the twisted version of events Carol was feeding him. I told my dad I'd send Jacob some gifts and maybe call him more often just to keep our bond strong. But when it came to Carol and Alyssa, I was done. They had used guilt, manipulation, and now outright trespassing to get what they wanted. The only thing left for me to do was make sure they never tried again. Before hanging up, I told my dad as calmly as I could that I didn't want to hear another excuse, another misunderstanding, or another plea for sympathy. I said that what Carol and Alyssa did was not a mix-up. It was illegal. Then I told him plainly that if they ever tried anything like that again, I'd press charges. After the apartment incident, things went quiet for a while. Carol stopped calling, and for a moment, I thought the chaos had finally ended. My dad and I kept in touch, mostly brief calls about work and Jacob, but I could tell life at home wasn't peaceful. Then one night he called, sounding defeated. Things had fallen apart fast. Alyssa's baby daddy had resurfaced. He wanted visitation rights but refused to pay support. He showed up at their house shouting about his rights, causing scenes that even Carol couldn't control. While she tried to manage that mess, my dad discovered his finances were collapsing. Strange charges appeared on his credit card, and when he looked closer, he realized Carol had been secretly paying Alyssa's bills, rent, groceries, even beauty appointments, with his money. She had maxed out multiple cards and was drowning in debt. When he confronted her, she cried and claimed she did it for Alyssa and the baby, but this time he didn't believe her. For years, she'd hidden manipulation behind guilt, but now the mask was off. My dad finally saw that she wasn't trying to hold the family together. She was controlling it. A few days later, he packed a bag and left. He showed up at my door looking older, heavier, as if the last few years had caught up all at once. He stayed with me for a week. We talked for hours about everything. How Carol twisted situations, used guilt to get money, and painted me as the problem. He called the bank, froze the cards, and started separating his finances. It hurt him to do it, but he knew it was the only way out. The hardest part for him was realizing Jacob had started repeating Carol's words, saying things like, "Ethan doesn't like us." That was when he knew something had to change. By the time he left, he looked worn down, but something in him had shifted. For the first time, he saw Carol clearly for who she was. He looked tired, but I could see in his eyes that something had changed. Last month marked the end of a chapter that had been dragging on for far too long. My dad finally filed for divorce. After years of excuses, guilt, and emotional chaos, he'd had enough. When he called to tell me, his voice sounded steady for the first time in years. Not angry, not bitter, just done. He said the paperwork had been filed that morning and that he felt lighter, even though he knew the months ahead would be messy. It turned out that what we thought we knew about Carol's financial habits was only the surface. Once lawyers got involved, they uncovered everything. She hadn't just been paying Alyssa's bills with his credit cards, she had been draining their joint savings account for years. Little by little, she'd been funneling money into separate accounts under her name, all while pretending to be managing household expenses. When confronted, she tried to spin it as keeping things organized, but the evidence spoke for itself. There were transfers, cash withdrawals, and even payments to stores she had no reason to be using. My dad had spent years working overtime, thinking he was saving for retirement, for Jacob's future, for something meaningful. Instead, Carol had been bleeding the account dry while lecturing everyone else about family responsibility. Her world finally collapsed when the court ordered a full financial review. For someone who lived off appearances, having everything exposed was worse than losing the money itself. After she moved out, she tried to maintain her image. She told her friends she was starting fresh, but it wasn't hard to see the truth. She ended up in a small rental apartment on the edge of town, sharing it with Alyssa and the baby. The pictures Alyssa posted online tried to make it look cozy, but the bitterness bled through every caption. They blamed everyone, me, my dad, even the baby's father, for their downfall. In their version of the story, Carol was the martyr who had been betrayed by ungrateful men. My dad, on the other hand, finally found peace. He used what was left of his personal savings to buy a modest house about 15 minutes from me. It wasn't large or fancy, but it was his, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't have to walk on eggshells in his own home. I helped him move in, set up furniture, and hang a few pictures. One of them was of Mom, which he placed on the mantel without hesitation. That moment hit me harder than I expected. It felt like the house was already more of a home than the one he'd shared with Carol for years. Jacob started spending weekends with him soon after. He was a different kid away from Carol, more relaxed, more talkative, laughing like a 6-year-old should. My dad said that at first, Jacob had been confused about why his mom and sister weren't around, but he was adjusting quickly. Kids sense peace even when they don't understand it. One evening, I went over for dinner. My dad grilled burgers, Jacob drew pictures at the table, and for the first time in years, there wasn't a single moment of tension. At one point, Jacob looked up and asked if my apartment still belonged to me. I smiled and told him, "Yeah, buddy, and it always will." He grinned and went back to coloring like it was the most natural thing in the world. But for me, that moment said everything. That little comment from him brought it full circle. The same 6-year-old who once unknowingly exposed Carol's manipulation had just reminded me how far we'd come. That dinner years ago, when he repeated what his mom had been whispering about my apartment, had been the best accidental warning I could have received. It was the spark that made me see how far Carol was willing to go, and it was the first step towards setting boundaries that actually meant something. Carol got exactly what she deserved in the end. She lost control, lost the comfort she took for granted, and had to face the consequences of her own choices. Alyssa was still jobless, still bouncing from one excuse to another, and still clinging to the illusion that the world owed her something. My dad, meanwhile, had started living again. He joined a community group, took Jacob to soccer games, and even started smiling in pictures again. It was like he'd been underwater for years and had finally come up for air. As for me, I kept my apartment leased for a while before moving back in. Walking through the door again felt surreal. It wasn't just a place anymore, it was a symbol of everything I'd fought to protect. The walls still had the same cracks. The balcony door still stuck a little, but it was mine. Every inch of it reminded me that I'd made the right choice. Sometimes on my way to my dad's house, I'd drive past the building just to see it. The sight of it always makes me smile, not because it's anything special, but because of what it represents. No matter how hard they try to take it, they never could. Not the apartment, not my independence, and not my peace. It took years, but I finally learned that family isn't defined by guilt or obligation. It's defined by respect, honesty, and the willingness to let people grow instead of controlling them. For a long time, I thought saying no made me selfish. Now I understand that saying no was the only thing that kept me sane. Every time I see Carol's name pop up in a random story through mutual acquaintances, I feel nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just relief. She had spent years trying to pull everyone into her chaos, and for once I stayed out of it completely. And every time I drive past my apartment building, I smile knowing that no matter how hard they tried to take it, they never could, because I finally stopped letting family guilt cost me peace.